President Cyril Ramaphosa is one of the leading advocates for the reform of the United Nations Security Council. He again made this a cornerstone of South Africa's foreign policy and a necessity for more just global order. His arguments, presented at the UN General Assembly and summits of the BRICS bloc, center on the Council's archaic future, which he argues undermines its legitimacy. Let's unpack this with Professor of Political Economy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Isaac Khambule. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thanks very much for your time. I mean, calls for the reform of the United Nations aren't new. It's just something that hasn't been happening.
It's something that hasn't been happening over the last 3 decades. We know that it's not just South Africa, it is also African nations, it is also the BRICS nations that are calling for a reform, particularly within the UN Security Council, where they want to have more representation, where they want to ensure that they have a permanent member seat. And again, these are things that are also reflective of the current landscape where we find ourselves, because we understand without the veto power that states such as the US, Russia, and China enjoy, we will not be in this particular turmoil. So there's definitely a need to ensure broader representation, again, that the will of the entire world is definitely going to be implemented.
If one was to play devil's advocate here, what will the world be without, or does the world need a United Nations?
I think that is where, again, some of the questions were emerging from Vuyo, looking at the efficacy of the UN, particularly if we look at the current global affairs that we are seeing. You see that Trump is busy criticizing the UN in terms of its efficacy, in terms of how global policies that are related to migration have been shifted towards the UN. And again, some of the right wing also seeing the UN as a source of this contestation. But then again, if you look at the current landscape, I would definitely argue that there is definitely a need for the UN, because there are particular decisions that are taken within the UN that are very important, such as in terms of ensuring peace, in terms of promoting broader economic development. But I think the one key issue that has been a major failure is the issue of Israel committing genocide and nothing happening, because now it's bordering on issues of international norms. If you look at issues of state sovereignty, if you look at issues again of recognition of a state, and then as well as issues of human rights. So these are quite topical issues, and they may also assist us in terms of really trying to push for a reform of the UN to reflect a multipolar world.
But isn't the UN, in fact, part of the problem, in the sense that with all these countries that have veto powers, it then gets to stand in the way of doing things differently? It's precisely why the Israel-Palestine situation still can't be resolved.
Definitely, and I think that's one of the key things that we need to really look at. If we look at the issue of veto power, do we need particular states to have veto power in global affairs? It can't be when 98% or 99% of the world agrees that there needs to be a ceasefire, and one party says no, and therefore that we can't have a ceasefire. There is why, again, the idea of reforming the UN is quite important. And again, going forward, the issue of veto power needs to be discussed in order to ensure broader representation, in order to ensure fairness at the end of the day, not a particular situation whereby only the powerful states determine what is the UN agenda or determines how peace is going to look like.
Well, I mean, we did see this week, I mean, we have France, for example, which was responsible for calling that high-level meeting that President Cyril Ramaphosa, among others, addressed right at the beginning on Tuesday. Does that suggest that perhaps painfully slow as that progress may be, but there is some progress? In other words, slowly but surely, the things are beginning to change.
It definitely, it does suggest that. I mean, if you look at countries such as Canada, we look at countries such as France, Australia, and the UK, basically saying they do recognize the Palestinian state. But one of the core issues that we're facing now is Are these states going to go fully in terms of implementing this particular resolution that they have taken, or it is just going to be an issue of flag independence? Because we know they can say you have the rights, but then as it is also these very states again that are also putting into the table saying this is how a Palestinian state should look like, of which basically means that you do not have full independence, because again, as we've seen, so many of these countries are saying that the Palestinian state must not be able to arm itself, of which does not necessarily make sense. What do you do as a state if you are attacked tomorrow? Because again, what it is also opening up to is a particular situation that we currently have that says, yes, we can definitely exist by name, but then in terms of the fundamental rights such as your sovereignty, we are not going to give that to you, of which again is going to be the major focal point. And again, if you look at the stance that has been taken by the US, in as much as the US does indeed see the need right now, we know quite soon majority of the US senators are going to Israel, of which again is going to push a portion that says the US is standing by Israel, of which again likely means that your UK, your front, in as much as they are pushing this particular agenda, they are most unable to push through with it if indeed Donald Trump then pushes them not to acknowledge such resolutions.
And while the focus, of course, was on Palestinian statehood, I mean, other wars tend to be or have been forgotten. What's happening in Sudan, what's happening in the DRC.
No, definitely. I mean, there's quite a lot of things that are happening currently in Sudan. We're looking at DRC, and we saw that even President Trump came out and said he stopped the ongoing war or genocide in the DRC, of which again happens to be untrue based on how he tends to do things. But in this case, I think the most important thing is if we look at the issues of Sudan, and then again we look at casualties, it is not at the same scale as we often see within the cause of the Palestinians. And right now, again, issues of Sudan again also reflect particular failures within the African context, of which is where again the African Union needs to play an important role in terms of being able to address these particular issues that are happening in Sudan, that are happening in DRC, because these are things that have been happening for decades and there has been no solution to this particular day. And again, it reflects that Africa will only be able to have a stronger voice if it is also able to address some of its core issues that it's facing continentally, so that it can go to the UN and say, we have this voice of reason because we are able to also address these particular issues at our continental level, and we want to play an important role in a diplomatic level in terms of ensuring that we can use our power and influence to ensure that we can build a more peaceful world.
Well, of course, outside of the conventional wars, we have wars of a different kind. President Cyril Ramaphosa telling world leaders yesterday that trade is now being used as a weapon, and no prizes for guessing what and who he was talking about there.
I mean, quite true. We also look at Lula also spoke at the core issue of trade and how it has been weaponized against Brazil in terms of the decisions that it has taken, oppositions. Again, I mean, if you also look at issues of China, we are looking at how Trump was also going at the EU saying you are busy buying oil and gas from Russia, whereas we are trying to also ensure that we can impose sanctions. But at the end of the day, it is also the US that is also buying a number of other things from Russia. And at this particular rate, it seems to be the case that Trump is willing to do anything that he can do on his part to ensure that America emerges as the biggest winner. Again, if you also look at the issue of the HP visas, with many nationals from India likely to be affected by those particular issues. Again, it shows you that at the end of the day, Trump has been wielding this particular trade war agenda, and he seems to be thinking that the US is going to win. But from where we are standing again, we are expecting the likes of the G20 to also play an important role in terms of shaping the future that we want to see. And hopefully those are some of the discussions that will be topical when we host the G20 in November.
Of course, I mean, this conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about Donald Trump's speech after that broken teleprompter.
Donald Trump always being Donald Trump, Vuyo. And again, it goes to particular things that we've been seeing in the US, because it was not only an issue of what Donald Trump faced, but if you also look at the other speakers who were, in a way, lost the audio when they were speaking against the issues of Palestinian and as well as Israel, those are some of the core issues that were happening, and no one is mentioning them, but they're only mentioning what Trump was saying because of this agenda that, okay, the UN is based within the US, so thereby whatever happens, the US needs to be responsible for it, and that the US must be respected. I mean, you go as far as Trump complaining that he wanted to renovate the UN building, but then they refuse, and now it doesn't look as appeasing as he wants it to be. Because at the end of the day, it is all about Donald Trump himself and wanting to wield particular power. But at the end of the day, we also see the reactions from within the US that it was not a speech that was quite welcome, because again, it is also pushing the US away from majority of the states that are wielding power.
I read somewhere someone making an argument that perhaps the world should start imagining a world without the United States, and with that, a United Nations without the United States of America. There were several arguments presented, among which was the fact that the US contributes handsomely financially to the running of the US, and how a world and a UN without the US might mean giving more power, in fact, and to your Chinas and to your Russias. Should we imagine, or can we imagine, a world without the US as part of the UN, but also a world just without the US altogether?
Then it is quite impossible to do so, because we know from a financial muscle perspective, it is the US that has been bankrolling the UN and a number of its agencies. Again, we saw in terms of the US wanting to pull out in terms of the World Health Organization as to what is likely to be the impact there. But at the same time, we must also be cautious, in as much as some say that the US is the better devil, because what often happens is China wants a particular global order that is also going to suit its narrative, and that is where, again, issues of human rights are also considered, then, as to what does the world look like with China basically being a world leader, and then others are also looking at the idea of Russia being a world leader. So how does a world look like? So at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is we need to be pushing for a multipolar world whereby each and every state will be able to navigate international affairs and be able to position itself within the multipolar world, knowing that there won't be disadvantage for being in one group or for following particular policies. So as it stands, I think the US is very important. It plays a critical role. But again, we are also seeing within the US that they have major human rights issues that are currently happening because of the work that is being done by us, of which, again, are also pushing the US as it is. I mean, if you look at one of the contestants who wants to become the president in the US, Kevin Newzroom, is busy saying there is a likelihood that there won't be any elections in the US in 2028 by judging in terms of how things are currently going. So the US is also teetering towards a military state. So what happens then? Who becomes the voice of reason? Those are some of the arguments, and that is why the idea of a multipolar world is very important, so that we can have an emergence of a new just world order that some of the BRICS countries have been calling for. But at the end of the day, we know there are particular states that are going to be serving their interests. But how do we also promote human rights to be at the epicenter of the new world order that we want to see?
Professor of Political Economy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Isaac Khambule, thank you very much for your time.